I'm sure it's a beautiful day outside and you'd rather be eating your lunch in the sun than in this windowless room, but I'm sure our guest speaker here is going to make it worth your while. So my name is Elodie. I work with Carbontalks. We're an SFU-based organization that helps municipalities, businesses, and communities transition to a low-carbon economy. And as part of our work, we host every month a speaker here to talk about some of the low-carbon issues. So we're very happy to have Boyd Cohen today. So Boyd has quite a CV. I had to bring my notes because it's quite long. Boyd is a writer, a researcher, a professor of sustainable entrepreneurship at UVic in BC. He's also an entrepreneur himself and a consultant. And his focus has been on resilient cities and climate capitalism, which is a big word, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot about it today. I know Boyd has just released his most recent book called Climate Capitalism earlier this year. I think there'll be a chance at the end of the session to grab a copy of his book if you're interested. I know we have little time, so I'm not going to dwell anymore. I'll give the floor to Boyd, who will have about a 20-minute presentation, and then after that, a 40-minute discussion. So if you'd like to keep your questions for after the presentation, it'll make things go a little faster, I think. So Boyd, what is yours?
Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming. I see some of you do actually do the brown bag lunch or some styrofoam version of the lunch. My lunch will be afterwards. So today's topic's on resilient cities. I'm going to do a deep dive into what that is and take you on a tour around the world, essentially, as much as I can in this enclosed room. So, we've all heard about climate change. There's a lot of debate in some sectors of the economy and politics about whether or not climate change is real and what role human beings have to play in that. I'm not talking about that today. We could if you have questions or want to have a dialogue about it. What I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start this as a presentation with the assumption that you all actually recognize that climate change is a threat to cities and to our way of living and to our economies. And so I'm moving on to addressing what are the solutions from a city perspective, primarily. So the book, as she mentioned, that I wrote is called Climate Capitalism. It's a sequel to Natural Capitalism. I wrote it with Hunter Lovins. And in that, we focus on both, we focus on municipalities, on communities in general, and on companies and governments in general around the world, what they're doing to profitably address climate change from a mitigation perspective, which is how to reduce their emissions, as well as from an adaptation perspective, which is how do you economically address the risks associated with climate change. So in the past few years, we've seen a couple we've seen dozens of very high-profile examples of what climate change is doing to our communities. While no one would actually argue that climate change causes hurricanes, it definitely exacerbates the intensity of them and increases the frequency of them. And those have caused problems, as well as other types of storms. That's from the heat wave in Moscow from last summer that caused $15 billion in loss to the Russian economy. That's from Pakistan, the floods in Pakistan. We've got Hurricane Katrina. That was obviously a multi-billion-dollar disaster in the U.S. that they're still recovering from several years later. We have disappearing glaciers in Bolivia that affect municipalities like the capital of La Paz. We've been there numerous times for work. They're running out of water because they depended on glacier melt that no longer exists. That glacier they used to ski on this glacier, and it's now gone entirely. It's disappeared. The scientists about 10 years ago predicted by 2015 it would largely be gone, and it ended up disappearing about 6 years earlier. So, more doom and gloom. What does this mean to the economy? The National Research Defense Council did a study of the U.S. If business as usual continued, what would be the impact to the U.S. economy? Looking at just 4 target areas of impacts if we do nothing about climate change between now and then, both the mitigation side and adaptation. And what you see at the bottom, this number here is a $1.8 trillion annual projected cost of the U.S. economy, business as usual by 2100 if we do nothing. Now, I was here, I think it was at SFU or somewhere recently, where I was on a panel with Bill Reese, and we were talking about climate change and what humans are doing about it. And Bill Reese might be, he kind of admittedly is known for being a bit of a pessimist about these things. And I'm actually admittedly an optimist about it. So while you're seeing some negative, sort of painful things right now, I'm going to quickly switch gears and start talking about where the opportunities are, which is really my focus. I have a PhD in business. So I look at climate change from the perspective of where are the opportunities to address this potentially devastating challenge associated with climate change in a way that's profitable for communities and for companies. So my view is climate capitalism coupled with courageous politicians is the only path to economic prosperity. So while a lot of people are trying to make the argument that if we try to act on climate change, it's going to be too expensive, I make the argument that if we don't act on climate change, it's going to be too expensive. And that's actually, this woman was a former Republican governor, and they came out with a report that was called Pay Now, Pay Later. Basically saying if we don't act now, we're going to pay a lot later due to all of these types of impacts that we already discussed. I said they should have called it profit now or pay later, because if you actually do this in the smart way now, you can find ways to generate profits either through energy efficiency or revenues from renewables and other solutions rather than paying all the costs of climate change later. Here's a bunch of famous climate capitalists, some of them billionaires like Branson, and Al Gore's a little controversial. There's the world's first solar billionaire from China. So sometimes I do this talk and people say, well, yeah, you're right, we need courageous politicians, but I haven't seen one yet. And so here's my 10 examples. Many of them are heads of state, many of them are conservative, of politically elected leaders previously and currently that have actually taken a stand on climate action and actually see the economic benefits from doing so. So there's the book, there's my famous co-author, Hunter Lovins. You see, we did a launch with Gregor Robertson a few months ago. So, why cities? Why are we talking about resilient cities? Why are cities so important? Obviously, more than 50% of the world's population now lives in cities. That's happened over the last couple of years, and that's a very new, it's the first time in the history of the world. We have more people living in cities than we do in rural areas. I don't know if any of you saw the other day the new UN projections on population growth. We've been saying for a long time we might get to 10 billion by 2100. The UN just came out with a new estimate, 15 billion. 15 billion people. We're at just under 7 billion right now. So in 90 years we could potentially double our population. And most of those people are going to be living in cities. Somewhere around 80% of our emissions and our energy consumption comes from cities. And of course we live and work in cities, most people. Our transportation impacts are mostly in cities. Our food is distributed into our cities. So cities have a huge impact. And the other thing I really love about cities is that they actually have more autonomy and they're not as dependent on multilateral agreements. So we've all been very disappointed, depressed, frustrated by lack of progress with multilateral agreements related to the United Nations process to get a new climate accord agreed to. It's been very challenging and difficult. Imagine getting all of us in this room to agree that climate change exists, that we've got to do something about it, and we individually are prepared to commit what percentage of our revenues, of our income, to address climate change in some way. Now try getting almost 200 countries around the world to agree to that, when they're all looking at different economic situations and different roles in climate change and in the solutions to it. But as you can see, cities are hugely important. I did a study a couple months ago that I published, and it was looking at what are the top cities around the world doing to become resilient. What do I mean by resilient? I'm specifically referring to climate resiliency, and depends on who you ask how they want to define it. I view climate resilient cities as cities that are doing world-class things with respect to mitigating their emissions, that is, finding ways to reduce their emissions, as well as adapting to a future climate reality that's different than today. And I'll give you some more details. But here are the top 10 cities that came out of my study. As you see, Vancouver's on there. For any of you, did anybody read the study? They know where Vancouver came out? Fifth. So, take you on a tour through the world. I'm glad they took the lights off. So there's Copenhagen. Copenhagen, so we want to be the green, Vancouver wants to be the greenest city in the world. I spoke up at our city council meeting. We were talking about the greenest city action plan. And I said I totally encourage everything we are doing right now, but we're never going to be the greenest city by 2020. We're green, we're one of the greenest, but we'll never be the greenest. We're not going to be Copenhagen, not by 2020. Copenhagen has a goal to be carbon neutral by 2025, and they're already on the way to being there. So they're way ahead of us. Not only that, 40% of their population cycles to work. I lived in Copenhagen, this was about 10 years ago probably, and I couldn't believe how many people in suits, they wear their suits and they go to work in their suits on their bikes. So it's a very different cycling culture. There you wouldn't have the upheaval we've had here when the mayor wants to create additional bike lanes. There they have more problems with traffic congestion on their bike paths than they do on their streets. Curitiba, this is a surprise to some who just assume that all the world-class cities in this area must be developed country, cities in developed countries, but Curitiba is world-class in what they've been doing for decades now to address their sustainability in many ways. They introduced this system, which is it's a bus rapid transit system. Here you can see it. They're the first in the world to do it. It's now been replicated in like 80 cities around the world. We say that our 99 bus is a bus rapid transit, but it's not as rapid as their transit system. They have about 1 million riders a day on that system. Another thing they did, very interesting, and they were way ahead of their time, was they created floodable parks. What happened is the city is basically along a river. It's actually the highest elevation city that I studied, so it's not exposed to sea level rise, but it's exposed to regular flooding from the river. They devised a system of parks alongside the river that flooded every rainy season. So rather than letting it flood and the rainwater get into and provoke problems into the city more frequently, they said, well, what if we created parks all around these riverways so that they could actually absorb the rainwater, retain the rainwater, rather than have it cause flooding in the city. And during the low rain season, they could actually become great places for families to enjoy the outdoors.